8 guns, 4 in each wing. Count them as the camera moves down the wing. 1, 2, 3, 4. Flip to the other side. 5, 6, 7, 8. Now look at the Bf-109, 2 guns in the cowling, inches from the centreline. 1 cannon firing straight through the propeller hub. The standard story is that more guns meant more firepower, but there's a physics problem called convergence, and it means that at most distances, half your shots always miss. This isn't a video about which fighter was better. That argument's been done to death. This is about geometry. What happens when you mount a gun 15 feet from the centerline of an aircraft and ask its bullets to hit the same spot as a gun mounted on the nose? Picture a single Browning .303 sitting in the Spitfire's right wing. If you mounted that gun perfectly parallel to the aircraft's centerline, its bullets would fly in a straight line, 7 feet to the right of wherever the pilot's gunsight was pointing, forever. They'd never intersect with the line of sight, never hit what the pilot was aiming at. Obviously, that's useless. So the RAF's armourers angled each gun slightly inward. A tiny cant. We're talking fractions of a degree. Just enough that the bullet path from each wing gun would eventually cross the aircraft's centreline at a predetermined distance. They called this harmonisation. And for most of the Battle of Britain, the standard harmonisation distance was 250 yards. At exactly 250 yards ahead of the aircraft, all 8 bullet streams converged on the same point. At that range, the effect was devastating. 8 Brownings cycling at roughly 1,150 rounds per minute each. Combined rate, about 160 rounds every second, pouring into a beaten zone maybe 2 or 3 feet across. Nothing survived that. But here's the thing. That convergence point was one distance. 1. Before it, the streams hadn't met yet. Beyond it, they'd already crossed and were spreading apart again. And the farther you got from 250 yards in either direction, the worse it got. Walk through it range by range. At 100 yards, well short of convergence, the 8 streams form 2 separate clusters. 4 impacts grouped to the left, 4 grouped to the right. A gap in the middle. That gap sits directly over the spot where the pilot's gunsight is pointed, directly over the enemy aircraft. At 200 yards, the clusters are closing. They're starting to overlap. A large target, a bomber fuselage, would catch most of the rounds. A Bf-109 fuselage, barely 4 feet wide. Good luck. At 250 yards, everything comes together. Tight, concentrated, lethal. At 300 yards, the streams have crossed and they're diverging. The left wing's bullets are now drifting right of centre. The right wing's bullets are drifting left. The pattern is opening back up. Rounds are starting to pass on either side of a fighter-sized target. At 400 yards, the spread is roughly 10 to 12 feet across. A Bf-109 sits in the middle of that spread, like a fence post in a field. Most rounds sail past on either side, punching through empty air. You're firing. Your guns work fine. Geometry just won't let the bullets connect. At 500 yards, essentially hopeless against a single-engine fighter. So the effective kill zone, the range band where the Spitfire's 8 guns could reliably concentrate enough rounds on a fighter-sized target, was roughly 150 yards wide, maybe from 200 to 300 yards out, depending on harmonisation pattern and how good the pilot's tracking was. That's your window. Outside it, you're fighting physics, and physics doesn't care how brave you are. And there's a second layer. Bullet drop. The .303 Browning round leaves the muzzle at about 2,440 feet per second. Fast. But the instant it's airborne, gravity starts pulling it down. At 250 yards, the drop is around 18 inches. The armourers compensated by angling each gun slightly upward in addition to inward. But again, that upward angle was calibrated for the harmonisation range. Beyond it, rounds drop below the aim point, as well as scattering horizontally. You're not just wide, you're low. The dispersion happens in 3 dimensions. Now, and this is important, there were 2 schools of thought on harmonisation patterns. Point convergence meant all 8 guns aimed at the same spot. Maximum destruction at the sweet spot. Tiny margin for error everywhere else. Spread pattern meant the guns were aimed at slightly different points within a defined box, roughly 6 feet wide by 4 feet tall. Less devastating if your aim was perfect, but far more forgiving when it wasn't. And in a dogfight, it usually wasn't. Some squadrons chose one, some chose the other. This was one of the many trade-offs that Fighter Command navigated throughout the war. Which brings us to the Bf-109. The 2 MG-17 machine guns sat in the cowling, directly above the Daimler-Benz engine, synchronized to fire between the propeller blades. They were inches from the aircraft's centreline. Inches. Their bullet paths needed almost no inward angle at all. The streams ran essentially parallel to the flight path and converged almost immediately. At 100 yards, they hit where the nose pointed. At 200 yards, the same. At 400 yards, still the same. From the Bf-109F onward, Messerschmitt added the motor Kanone, an MG-151/20 20mm cannon mounted between the engine's cylinder banks, its barrel extending straight through the hollow propeller shaft. Dead centerline. 0 offset, 0 convergence geometry. Wherever the pilot pointed the nose, that's where the cannon shell went, at any range. A 109 pilot didn't need to be at a specific distance to concentrate his fire. He just needed to point and shoot. So why didn't everyone mount guns on the nose? Simple. There wasn't room. You could fit 2 machine guns in the cowling of a single-engine fighter. Maybe a cannon through the hub if your engine had a hollow crankshaft. But the Spitfire's Merlin didn't have a hollow crankshaft. And 2 rifle-caliber machine guns couldn't deliver enough destructive energy in the tiny window of a combat engagement. Which is exactly the calculation that squadron leader Ralph Sawley made in the early 1930s. Sawley headed the Operational Requirements section at the Air Ministry. His job? Figure out what the next generation of RAF fighters would need to kill the next generation of bombers. All-metal monoplanes, faster, tougher. Self-sealing fuel tanks and armour plate coming soon. His analysis showed a fighter would get about 2 seconds of firing time during a typical interception pass. 2 seconds. He calculated the weight of fire needed to cripple an all-metal airframe in that window. 2 guns weren't enough. 4 were marginal. 8.303 Brownings, delivering roughly 14 pounds of bullets in a 2-second burst, crossed the threshold. That calculation drove Air Ministry specification F.10/35, issued in 1935. Single-seat monoplane fighter, no fewer than 8 machine guns. Both the Hurricane and the Spitfire were built to meet it. And here's the crucial context that prevents this from being a gotcha story. Sawley was planning to intercept bombers. Big targets, 60 feet of wingspan, 20 feet of fuselage cross-section. Against something that large, even a dispersed bullet pattern at off-convergence ranges would land plenty of hits on something vital. An engine, a fuel line, a control cable. The convergence problem was real, but it was manageable against the targets the specification was designed for. Nobody in 1935 was imagining prolonged dogfights against a target barely 4 feet wide, jinking and rolling at wildly changing ranges. When the Battle of Britain arrived in the summer of 1940, Spitfires found themselves in exactly that scenario. Locked in turning fights with Bf 109s, where the range oscillated constantly, and the pilot might pass through the convergence sweet spot for a fraction of a second. The specification wasn't stupid. It was designed for a different war. Sailor Malan understood this viscerally. Adolf Sailor Malan, the South African-born commander of No. 74 Squadron, commanded the squadron during the Battle of Britain and turned his combat experience into a document that every fighter pilot in the RAF read, his famous 10 Rules of Air Fighting. Rule number 1 came straight out of the convergence problem, even if he didn't use that word. Wait until you see the whites of his eyes. Get close. Malan urged pilots to close inside 250 yards before firing, to fight their way into the convergence band and stay there. Easier said than done when someone's shooting back. The statistics tell the story just as clearly. Estimates of the average rounds fired per confirmed aerial kill run to several thousand. Figures of 4,500 to 5,000 rounds per destroyed aircraft were commonly cited in RAF gunnery assessments. Much of that was ammunition wasted outside the effective convergence band. Convergence was only one reason, but for wing gun fighters it was a big one. Which brings us to a different engineering problem entirely. One that 2 separate people independently asked about. And it starts with a woman on a motorcycle. Beatrice Tilly Schilling was born in 1909 and earned a Master of Science in Mechanical Engineering from the University of Manchester. Before she ever touched an aircraft engine, she'd already earned a Brooklands Gold Star for lapping the famous circuit at over 100 miles per hour on a motorcycle. She was, by every account, fierce, no-nonsense, and absolutely precise. In 1936, she joined the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, and by 1940 she was face to face with one of the most dangerous problems in fighter command. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine used an SU carburettor with a float chamber design, wonderful under normal flight conditions, catastrophic under -G. When a Spitfire or Hurricane pilot pushed the stick forward to enter a dive, a basic combat maneuver, the negative gravitational force caused fuel to flood the carburettor. The engine coughed, spluttered, and cut out. Sometimes for just a second, sometimes longer. In combat, a second was forever. The Bf 109's Daimler-Benz 601 used fuel injection. No float chamber, no flooding problem. A 109 pilot could shove the nose down into a dive any time he wanted, full power, no interruption. Spitfire and Hurricane pilots had to half-roll inverted first and pull back on the stick to enter the dive under +G. It worked, but it cost precious seconds and telegraphed the maneuver to the enemy. Schilling's solution was almost absurdly simple. A small brass restrictor, a washer-like disc with a calibrated hole, fitted into the fuel line to limit maximum fuel flow. Not enough to starve the engine at full power, but enough to prevent the catastrophic flooding under -G. Officially, it was called the RAE restrictor. Everyone in the RAF called it Miss Schilling's orifice. And yes, they knew exactly what they were saying. Starting in early 1941, Schilling personally travelled to operational squadrons, riding her motorcycle to frontline airfields to oversee the fitting. The restrictor wasn't a perfect fix. Under sustained -G, it could still cause problems. The complete solution came later with the adoption of the Bendix-Stromberg pressure carburettor. But Schilling's orifice was the stopgap that kept pilots alive in the gap between the problem and the permanent fix. A brass washer, designed by a motorcycle racer with a master's degree, fitted to Merlin's by the woman who invented it. It's the kind of engineering story that sounds too good to be true, and it's completely real. But let's come back to the guns, because the Spitfire didn't stay frozen in its 1940 configuration. That's the part of this story people don't talk about enough. The airframe evolved throughout the entire war, 24 marks plus subvariants spanning from 1938 to 1945 and beyond. And the armament evolution tells you that the RAF was learning in real time from exactly the trade-offs we've been discussing. The Mark I carried 8.303 Brownings, pure volume of fire. By the Mark V-B, the RAF had shifted to a mixed armament. Two 20mm Hispano cannons supplemented by 4.303s. Fewer guns, heavier punch per round. The late marks could carry 4 20mm cannon and nothing else. Fewer barrels, more energy per projectile. That's the convergence lesson, expressed in hardware. If each round is individually more destructive, you need fewer of them to connect. You can afford the wider dispersion of wing-mounted guns if every hit actually matters. A single 20mm Hispano shell delivered roughly 15 times the destructive energy of a .303 round. You didn't need 160 hits per second if a far smaller number of cannon strikes were each ripping through aluminium skin and structural spars. The Spitfire's other evolution was just as dramatic. When the Focke-Wulf 190 appeared over the Channel coast in autumn 1941, the Mark V was suddenly outclassed. Slower at most altitudes, outrolled, and unable to catch it in a dive. The response was the Mark IX, rushed into service with the two-stage supercharged Merlin 61 engine. An emergency measure born of near panic, but executed with remarkable speed. Then came the Griffon-engined Marks, the Mark XIV. The basic Spitfire airframe, designed in the mid-1930s, absorbed nearly double its original horsepower and kept flying. A 1936 design, still competitive in 1945. 9 years. In aviation years during wartime, that's a geological epoch. And here's the irony that ties everything together. The Bf 109 went through its own armament evolution, in the opposite direction. The early models relied on centreline guns, clean, accurate at all ranges. But as the war ground on and targets got tougher, the Luftwaffe needed more firepower from the 109. Starting with the G6 variant, they bolted underwing gondola pods carrying MG 151/20 cannons onto the airframe. The Rustsatz field conversion kits, wing guns, on the 109, which gave the Messerschmitt its own convergence problem. The pods added firepower, but degraded accuracy at off ranges and ruined the aircraft's roll rate and handling. Pilots hated them. Many had them removed in the field. Both sides started from opposite positions and drifted toward the middle. The RAF moved from many small wing guns toward fewer, harder-hitting ones. The Luftwaffe moved from precise centerline weapons toward wing-mounted additions when centerline firepower wasn't enough. Neither approach was wrong. Both were compromises, and both evolved as the war taught hard lessons. The Spitfire's genius was never its 1940 specification. 8.303s firing into a narrow convergence band, that was a compromise born from 1930s assumptions about bomber interception. Some of those assumptions held up, some didn't. What made the Spitfire extraordinary was that its basic airframe was flexible enough to absorb every lesson the war threw at it. New engines, new guns, new roles. The convergence problem didn't disappear. Wing-mounted guns always have it. But the move to fewer, more powerful cannon meant each round that did connect carried real authority. The problem wasn't solved. It was engineered around, iterated, improved. That's what engineering actually looks like. Not perfection on the first try. Adaptation. Over and over for 6 straight years. If you found this useful, subscribe. More like this is coming.